Muslim who was enslaved first. He was brought to this country and enslaved in the 1700s in Charleston, South Carolina. And when he was in Charleston, South Carolina, because of his small frame, he was not given the most horrible jobs to do, because even though they didn't care about working someone to death, he couldn't fulfill some of the heavy work. He couldn't lift the heavy loads. And so he had the opportunity to escape. And he escaped to Fayetteville, North Carolina. But if all of you, I'm sure, know better than I, how this institution demanded, like what was copied in the apartheid regime of South Africa, that if you want to travel from one area to the next, you better have a pass. You better have something showing that you have permission not to be on Master Joe's plantation right now. And if you're off, it better be saying where you're going and when you're expected to come back. So Omar ibn Said escaped from Charleston, and he made his way to Fayetteville, but things were not all right, because North Carolina, like South Carolina, was a slave state. So he didn't have a pass. He couldn't specify, I have permission, so he was locked up in a jail. And when Omar ibn Said was in this jail, he started, after a while, writing on the walls in charcoal. And so the enslavers would walk by and they said, man, that old fool, well, he wasn't old at this point, that dude in there, he has lost his mind. Look at that crazy stuff that he's writing on the wall. Something is really wrong with this guy. And so then one of the more enlightened of these people, of these oppressors, walked by and looked at it and he said, well, that's not gibberish. I've seen that before. That's actually Arabic. And so he said, yeah, that's Arabic. So they got somebody to come and to look what Omar was writing in charcoal on the walls. And the guy said, well, this is part of the Qur'an. This is part of their book. Actually, this is Al-Fatiha. This is the Fatiha. So Omar was taken out of the jail. He was put on another plantation. But on this plantation, he had some kind of special identity. They looked at him, oh, he's a very exceptional slave. He's very different. They can't read or write. They don't believe in a God, just those few people we've heard about. But not only could Omar write the Fatiha in Arabic, Omar ibn Said was a young Imam before being captured. So he started writing his story. Let me tell you my story that's written in the Arabic language. I don't know English. You're humiliating and ridiculing me, saying that I and my co-enslaved people are ignorant and dumb because we don't speak the English language. Did you ever think that maybe English was not the language that we spoke from where you captured us? Do you think because I can't read your books that we can't read and write? That language and reading and books was not a part of our history? And you're talking to a man that came from West Africa? And so this process began where it was recognized that Omar was a very learned individual. All across the South, there are examples of Omar ibn Said's. Let me share one other story and I'll move forward because I want to get to the presence here as quickly as I can. Look, one of the most amazing stories of all of the history that I know at this particular point about the presence of Islam amongst enslaved Africans and how fighting against all odds, they were able to transmit this for 1 or 2 generations, or it was completely wiped out, was the story of 2 enslaved Africans on islands off the coast of Georgia, one on St. Simeon Island, one on the Supalo Islands off the coast of Georgia. You had Bilal, Muhammad, and Salih Balahi. And do you know, when you read the story about these two individuals, and I just want to say something real quick, there was a real kind of enlightened enslaver by the name of Thomas Spalding. And even though he's in the deep South, he didn't think that we should just torture and abuse these enslaved Africans the way that we're doing. If you read the history of Georgia, the guy Oglethorpe, right, felt as the governor of Georgia that this should be a model state, that we want to create a state that shows how to use this labor in a more humanitarian and enlightened way. And so Thomas Spalding bought into this idea. And so what he allowed on his plantation were for the Muslims not to have to hide and pretend that they're Christian. He allowed them to form a Jamaat. He allowed Sahih Balahi, or Bilal Muhammad in particular, to organize a Jamaat. He allowed him to be the Imam of the Jamaat. And we're talking about Muslim scholarship and adhering and following and respecting Muslim scholarship. This man, Bilal Balahi Muhammad, was the first known African recorded scholar in the Americas. Recorded, known. He was writing in his handwriting too. He left behind a document of 13 pages in Arabic. It's set in Georgia, University of Georgia, or Georgia State, I forgot which library, for almost 100 years. It's set behind a glass, and no one bothered to translate it, or they had such difficulty translating it that it was about the 1930s, I think is the date, when they finally translated. They said that this is a book of Maliki fiqh. This brother was writing based on, he's given the dalil, these evidence, and based on this is what I find, this is what I'm ruling on. So we find that there was this ever-growing and ongoing struggle with the African Muslim slaves and their children to rebel against this strife, this struggle for social justice, that no, this is not, no human being is to be an abd, to be an abd. I mean, to be quite honest, the last time I made Umrah, maybe a couple of years ago, and it was one thing when I was your age, but it's another. I'm looking at both of you, everybody down there. When I was your all's age, I could go there, make Hajj, make Umrah, and you know, I don't know. But now, at my age now, to have someone younger than you looking at me, calling me, hey, Abba, hey, Abba, you know, you want to punch him in the face. I mean, you just want to, your hand just develop a mind of its own. And you're just like, man, I don't know where that came from. I just clocked this dude and broke his jaw. I didn't really mean to do it. But this, let me move forward here, that this period, when we look back at this history, it was an ongoing movement to try to maintain the Islamic scholarship. Georgetown section of Washington, D.C., Yarrow Mahmoud, and we believe it's corrupted, Yarrow Mahmoud lived to be over 100 years old. Here's a guy that a colonial painter, Charles Peale, painted his portrait as he was on the plantation. And the guy, this is the last story, I'm coming on to the present. But it's fascinating stuff. Now, Mahmoud, Yarrow, and I'll say Mahmoud rather than this Yahmad, Mahmud. Yarrow Mahmoud was his so-called master, told this painter who was going around painting plantation scenes that I have a real unique guy you might want to see. It's a real old guy, but I don't know if he has good sense or not. Because I can look at him at different times of the day and he's bumping like he's trying to knock his brains out of his head, just bumping his head on the floor. Certain times a year, I can't get the dude to eat when everybody else is eating. He said, no, I can't eat right now. I don't know what's wrong with him. He doesn't get drunk on Saturday nights when I allow everybody to just feel good and get drunk, do what they want to do. He doesn't do any of that stuff. He's a weird bird. I think he's lost his mind. So the painter realized that he wasn't crazy, that Yahweh wasn't crazy, that he was a Muslim who had maintained his Islam for over 40 years on a plantation. And just like so many others, and name after names, and I promise I'm going forward, so I'm going to go ahead and go forward. But it was a constant, ongoing struggle for the Muslims, those who could, to hold on to Islam, to be different, to set a kind of example even for others who were enslaved. Let me move a little further. Muslims, throughout this period of enslavement, the period of slavery in this country, up until today, have been involved in this human rights struggle, this human rights, this human justice campaign, however we want to characterize it. Did you know, and I'm sure you did, but I want to put some context to what I'm about to say. I'm going to put a little bit of context in it. Did you know that in the United States, what became known as the United States, that from the very beginning, from the first writing of the U.S. Constitution, even before the Constitution had the Constitutional Convention and it was written down, that there was a 10-year space between the celebrating 1776 establishment of independence from England and Britain and all this stuff. And it was 10 years that the Articles of Confederation were the governing document, right? And so in 1786, a white man by the name of Daniel Shays, who had been one of the veterans of the Revolutionary War, this is a white dude, got together with 4,000 other characterized then as rebels. Now they fought for the country's independence, but now they're saying, hey, look, man, we're not big landowners. I mean, what are we talking about here? You're reserving the rights to just an elite few. We're white folk. We're white men. And we're being denied rights because we're not landowners to the degree that would give us all of the rights. Not to mention, and I'm not putting this on a racial, defining the history on a racial basis. It's just a reality that with the coming of writing of Constitution and everything else, we're talking about Daniel Shay and those 4,000 people in Massachusetts were fighting against any kind of central and federal government because they're saying this stuff is unfair. This is not designed for common people, not just those folks who were enslaved. It ain't even fair if you're not a big landowner. They weren't in Mississippi. This was in Massachusetts. So you had this Shays rebellion going on, where white folks were recognizing that something about this ain't right. There were free blacks who were in Massachusetts, who were a part of the Shays rebellion. They said, well, you think it ain't right for you. Let me tell you what really is not right. What's not right is this institution of slavery that has so victimized our folks. Allah knows best. Whether or not there were Muslims, Allah knows best involved in the Shays rebellion. What we do know that there were Muslims prior to this who were involved in the Revolutionary War. Go to check Google. Check Google. If you don't read the books and the research, check Google will give you a few names. Right? Just go to check Google. You'll find out you can verify or dispel some of the things. I'm not saying do it right now. I want your attention just for a few minutes. But what happened, what we know, is that whether we're talking about the Revolutionary War, whether we're talking about the likelihood of Muslims being a part of Shays rebellion, because there were so many Muslims who were in Massachusetts, because it was a free state. Whether we are talking about the Native American predicament, as it's euphemistically called, predicament. You commit genocide against people for all these years and you call it a predicament. No, but the genocide against the Native Americans, when you study the history of the Native Americans and this period when like in the, before the like in late 1830s, and you look at what was going on, and folks were saying that these Native Americans, we got to get them off this land. This is a very rich, arable soil. We're not going to kill all of them. So what we're going to do, we're going to march them from South Carolina all the way down to Oklahoma. They're going to walk. Over half of them died. And in all sincerity, part of my family tells me that some of my ancestors, part of my family, were on this trail of tears and were marched down to Oklahoma, while others escaped and made it to the hills of North Carolina, where you have this eastern band of the Cherokees up here in eastern North Carolina. It was a horrible adventure. And so as they moved down, you had runaway enslaved Africans joining with a lot of these breakaway Africans and joining with Native American tribes, particularly in Florida, where the Spanish still maintained a lot of influence, and the Spanish were trying to undermine the British. So they were helping Native Americans from the assaults from the British, and they were welcoming, come on in, runaway slaves, come on in, and many of them came together. And so what I'm trying to present in getting to the present, and I'll be done just in a few minutes, is that when we talk about social justice movements, historically and up to this moment, we're talking about a drive, an effort to bring about human rights, bring about equality, to bring about justice. But what makes it a movement for the most part is oftentimes the intersectionality, that there's one group that is leading the charge for the most part. It's like the point of an arrow. But the intersectionality, recognizing that people from other groups, like the Native Americans, are many of them taking in these runaway Africans, saying that our future is better served if we join together to fight against these people. And so you have this kind of intermarriage, you have this kind of coming together, you have this exchange of religion and culture and language and all of these different kinds of things. It was an intersectionality. Even the anti-slavery movement. Look at it. Look at the history. It wasn't just a civil war that brought this to a head, to end hundreds of years of slavery. We're talking about white abolitionists. You're talking about black abolitionists who are coming together to try to galvanize the community, to educate the community. Let's bring free blacks who were former slaves. Let's bring them like a Frederick Douglass, like and Abdurrahman Ibrahim Ibn Sori, someone who was a slave for 40 years and he's freed and he goes back to West Africa. Let's bring him around the abolitionists and let him educate the people. Let him advocate for the abolishment of slavery. But it was an intersectionality of interests come together to try to best, how do we get this gorilla off of our back? And I'm not talking about any particular group of people. I'm talking about the system that is oppressing us. We can better help ourselves by working together to help each other. This is a primary characteristic for the purpose of this discussion of this social justice movement, that the history that we've had in this particular country. I could go on and talk about a number of things, but I want to get to the present. So I'll make this quantum leap to the present day. All of us who are of African descent, who are able, and all of us now are able to go wherever our money can, for the most part, wherever our money can afford, we're able to live and do all of these different things. And of course, for the younger people here, of course, it was not always like that. They need to know that we're standing on the shoulders of those who made tremendous sacrifices in order for us to be where we are today. But where we are today didn't come because of a change in moral and political consciousness of the legislators across this country. It came because they were forced by the ripples in the streets. They were forced that it became, now it was no longer comfortable. It was no longer an opportunistic venture for them, like George Wallace, the former governor of Alabama, who as a kid, I used to know about this fool, and he was the symbol of Southern bigotry as related to the political leadership in the South. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He was a mad dog racist, the governor. And it wasn't just George Wallace. But in 1968, he ran for president. So people all over the country now were able to listen to this fool and listen to a Southern politician articulate how they felt about people of color and more particularly about African American people. So people like this, sometimes they don't seem like real characters. They act in ways that were unbecoming a civilized human being. Not just an anti-racist or someone, but just anyone who has any semblance of humanity. The things that were done to those who put their lives and their bodies and everything else on the line. And again, it was an intersectionality. We have a common thread. We share a common thread other than just being Muslim. My father was a trade unionist. And I grew up with the rhetoric of trade unionism and its intersectionality with the civil rights movement because of my father's involvement in the South, in the Deep South. We were living in North Carolina, but he was all over the Deep South. And he would come home sometimes with bullet holes in his car. And each time he would come home, I would say, well, Dad, why are they shooting at you? What are they shooting at you for? And his thing was, well, I don't know if they're shooting at me because I'm a union man, or they're shooting at me just because I'm black. Because in the areas where I am, it happens on both ways, because of your color or because you are trying to promote trade unions. There was this intersectionality in the civil rights movement of the trade labor movement and the civil rights movement. There was an intersectionality of those in the American Indian movement. There was an intersectionality with Cesar Chavez and his organization of Chicano grape pickers. Not saying that disparagingly, but I forget. The Farm Workers Union, the Farm Workers Union. And so all of these came together. But primarily, while all of these major changes were being done, even after 1965, when the civil rights laws were passed, and Muslims were now en masse able to come from certain countries, Muslim countries that they hadn't come from, allowed to legally enter before, for the most part, the Muslims were absent from the front lines or the back lines of the civil rights struggle, the trade union struggles, and these other struggles. I'm not saying this is 100%, it's a generalization, but I think it's a very accurate characterization of how during this period of great social upheaval and change for the most part, and There are many, many exceptions, but for the most part, we were absent from this particular struggle. And we have benefited from the struggle, that for the most part, we were not present, with the exception of Muslims in and from the African American community. So, like in Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, who ended up becoming Muslim after he was incarcerated for his political and community activities, and many other notables. I'll try to move quickly forward. So here we are now, in a time where there's a president and there's a climate in this country that more closely resembles the time that created those movements in the 60s and 70s, closer than I've ever seen in my life. I'm not talking about historical life, things that I've read about, things that I've studied. But in my years on earth, the times in which we live today are closer to being like the times of the 60s, before the passage of the Civil Rights Act and all of these things, in the times of the 50s, that we are those of you who were too young to even know that these movements were existing. You were too young to be a part of them yourselves. Be patient, because now is the time that you have the opportunity to engage this society, to be able to take the faith, the religion of Islam, out of the walls of the masajid. Because if, and I'm saying this as a criticism, starting with myself, that if those of us who were involved in these struggles from decades ago, those of us who are now Muslim, that if we had shared this germ, this seed that had grown up in us about the responsibility to be a part of a justice movement, to stand for justice and these kinds of things, if we had done a better job of transmitting this to the next generations, then you, the young people who are activists today, would have a better framework for how to apply the guidance of Islam and insert this and be a part of a constructive social justice movement. Simply put, that I love seeing the young people being involved, no matter what the issues are as it relates to social justice. But it hurts me to my heart to hear them, as you said, the language. I mean, I was in DC maybe about a year ago now, and I was there participating in a demonstration. And some of the young Muslim brothers were having a sign, and it was something that 45 was doing at the time. And they had on the sign, and they had as part of their chants some of the language that we shouldn't come out of our mouth. And this was part of what they had on the signs, expressing how they felt about the 45th president. It's good that you're out there, but there's some certain adab that has to be followed while we're out there. We can't, our struggle, our intersectionality with other groups should not cause us to compromise our identity as Muslims. Now, I'll end on this note. The Council for Social Justice, as I said earlier, is an attempt by the national organization, Islamic Circle of North America, to programmatically address one of the critical areas of Muslim practice. Standing for justice is not just, something we can poo-poo. Well, that's just Khalid again. He's just off on another one of those justice tangents. The Muslim community has been charged by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be on a justice tangent. This is why we exist as an ummah. we exist not just as disconnected individuals who can have the best kind of adab and have the best kind of practice of Islam, but our impact is so limited that we can't bring about change in the larger society, because by no standards are we involved with the larger society. So what Islamic Circle in North America came to the understanding about, that no Muslim, and particularly no Muslim organization with the nature like Islamic Circle in North America. It's not like a masjid, it's an organization that is designed to have this extroverted program, to reach out with the message of dawah, to reach out with the message of social service, to reach out with the message of tarbiyah, and now to reach out with an organized, systematic way for the Muslims to have a vehicle that we can put boots on the ground, that we can involve our Muslim youth in activities of importance, but at the same token, providing guidance and direction to those youth. So we won't see young brothers and sisters carrying signs that have all kinds of profanity on it in different kinds of rallies. So towards this end, we have said that, and it's one thing that is very certain and very clear. The young people, one of the worst things that a young person can see from their elders and from their leaders is to feel that their leaders or their elders do not care, or they are detached and do not lend even a thought to the issues that they are confronting them today. The issues of the day, not chasing issues. But let me give you an example. Coming from that era of the civil rights and black power movements and having my various involvements, one of the worst labels that a leader could have during this period was what? Uncle Tom. If once you got the label as an Uncle Tom, then you were just, the youth would just wave their hand. You're of no relevance. You're such a compromising individual. Or either you are such a get along, can't we just get along? Like Rodney King after they whooped him half to death out there in LA. Can't we just get along? That you have compromised your ability to reach these youth, to be able to hear your voice by showing a disinterest in the affairs that are affecting them and affecting